Carino, the roses are dying again. The voice cut through the morning silence like a blade through silk, stopping Augustus mid-stride on the marble pathway. He froze, his coffee cup halfway to his lips, steam still rising in the crisp morning air. That wasn't English. It wasn't even Spanish, which most of his gardening staff spoke. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he set the cup down on the stone railing, the porcelain clinking against marble. The voice continued, flowing seamlessly into what sounded like French, then something that might have been Japanese. Augustus felt his chest tighten. In 40 years of owning this sprawling estate, he'd never heard anything like this from his carefully vetted English-speaking staff. He crept closer to the hedge maze, his Italian leather shoes silent against the dew-dampened stone. Through the perfectly manicured boxwood, he glimpsed a figure kneeling beside the rose garden. Dirt-stained khakis, a faded blue work shirt with rolled sleeves, and hands that moved with surgical precision as they tended to the thorny stems. The gardener, Elias, according to the employment records, was speaking to the flowers, actually speaking to them as if they were old friends who understood every word. "Vous êtes malades, mes amis," the man murmured, his voice carrying a tenderness that made Augustus's throat constrict. "But we'll fix this, won't we?" The switch to English was so fluid, it took Augustus a moment to register it had happened. But this wasn't the broken, heavily accented English he'd grown accustomed to from his staff. This was educated, refined, the kind of diction that belonged in boardrooms, not flower beds. Augustus stepped back, his heart hammering against his ribs. A branch snapped under his foot, and the gardener's head whipped around. For a split second, their eyes met through the hedge, Augustus's pale blue meeting Elias's deep brown, and something electric passed between them. "Mr. Augustus," Elias called out, his voice now carefully neutral, stripped of all the musical quality it had held moments before. "Is everything all right, sir?" "Fine," Augustus managed, his voice rougher than intended. "Just checking on the gardens." "Of course, sir." Elias nodded, averting his gaze. "I'll have the roses looking better by tomorrow." Augustus wanted to ask about the languages, about the poetry he'd heard in that voice, about the way the man's entire demeanor had shifted the moment he realized he was being watched. Instead, he turned and walked away, his mind racing faster than his feet. Back in his study, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the very garden where he'd made his discovery, Augustus couldn't concentrate on anything. The quarterly reports spread across his mahogany desk might as well have been written in hieroglyphics. Every few minutes he found himself glancing outside, searching for another glimpse of the mysterious gardener. The intercom on his desk buzzed. "Mr. Augustus?" Carmen's voice crackled through the speaker. His housekeeper had been with him for 15 years, efficient and unquestioning. "The gentleman from the import company is here for your 3 o'clock. Augustus glanced at his Rolex. Already, the morning had evaporated like morning mist. "Send him up." 20 minutes later, Augustus found himself across from Mr. Takeshi, a soft-spoken Japanese businessman who'd flown in specifically to discuss a partnership. The problem was, Mr. Takeshi spoke very little English, and the translator Augustus had hired was stuck in traffic across town. "I apologize for the inconvenience," Augustus began, gesturing helplessly. "Perhaps we could reschedule—" "Excuse me, sir." Carmen appeared in the doorway, wringing her hands. "The gardener is here about the sprinkler system repair. Says it's urgent." Augustus felt a spark of inspiration that bordered on madness. "Send him in." Elias entered the study, still in his work clothes, dirt smudged across his cheek. He looked confused, almost panicked, as he took in the formal setting, the leather chairs, the crystal decanters, Mr. Takeshi in his expensive suit. "Sir, I think there's been some mistake." "Elias," Augustus interrupted, his voice steady despite the wild beating of his heart. "I need you to help me communicate with our guest. Just try your best." The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Something shifted behind Elias's eyes, like a door opening in a darkened room. He straightened almost imperceptibly, and when he turned to Mr. Takeshi, his entire presence had changed. "Takeshi-san," Elias said, bowing with perfect precision. "Hajimemashite, watashi no namae wa Elias desu." Mr. Takeshi's face lit up like sunrise breaking over mountains. He responded rapidly in Japanese, his hands animated, his previous discomfort evaporating. For the next hour, Augustus watched in stunned silence as his gardener, conducted one of the most sophisticated business negotiations he'd ever witnessed. Elias didn't just translate, he mediated, interpreted cultural nuances, and even offered insights that clearly impressed Mr. Takeshi. When they finally shook hands on the deal, Mr. Takeshi turned to Augustus with obvious admiration. "Your assistant," he said in careful English, "is very special man." After Mr. Takeshi left, Augustus and Elias stood alone in the study. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. "Where did you learn Japanese?" Augustus's voice was barely above a whisper. Elias's hands were shaking slightly. I pick things up quickly, sir." "That wasn't picking things up. That was fluent, native-level fluent." Elias looked toward the window, toward the gardens, where he clearly felt more comfortable. "Is there anything else you need, sir? The roses really do need attention. How many languages do you speak?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Elias's shoulders sagged slightly, as if he'd been carrying a weight for too long. "Enough," he said finally. "Enough for what?" "Enough to know that people hear what they expect to hear. And they expect gardeners to speak like gardeners." The honesty in his voice hit Augustus like a physical blow. "Who are you?" Elias met his eyes for the second time that day, and Augustus saw something there that made his chest ache. Intelligence, yes, but also profound loneliness, the kind of isolation that comes from hiding who you are so completely that you begin to forget yourself. "I'm your gardener, sir." Nothing more. But as Elias turned to leave, Augustus caught him speaking under his breath, not in Spanish or English, but in something that sounded like Italian. The words were soft, almost like a prayer, and they followed him out of the room like ghosts. That night, Augustus couldn't sleep. He stood at his bedroom window, looking down at the gardens bathed in moonlight, and tried to make sense of what he'd witnessed. In his 68 years, he'd built a fortune on his ability to read people, to see through facades and pretenses. But Elias was an enigma wrapped in work clothes and covered in soil. The man was hiding something enormous. The question was, did Augustus want to know what it was? In the garden below, a figure moved between the rose bushes, barely visible in the darkness. Augustus watched as Elias knelt beside the flowers again, his lips moving in what looked like conversation. The roses seemed to lean toward him, as if they too could hear whatever language he was speaking to their roots. Augustus pressed his palm against the cool glass and made a decision that would change everything. The coffee was still steaming when Augustus made his way to the garden at dawn, 2 cups balanced carefully in his hands. He found Elias exactly where he expected, kneeling beside the rose bushes that had been struggling for weeks, his fingers gentle against the thorny stems. "Good morning," Augustus said, extending one of the cups. Elias looked up, startled. In the soft morning light, his features were more defined. High cheekbones, eyes the color of dark honey, silver threading through black hair at his temples. He had to be close to Augustus's age, maybe a few years younger. "Sir, it's just coffee." Augustus settled onto the stone bench nearby, surprised by how natural it felt to sit in his own garden instead of observing it from his window. "And it's Augustus. We're both too old for unnecessary formalities." Elias accepted the cup but didn't drink, his eyes wary. Is this about yesterday? Because I can explain. Actually, I was hoping you wouldn't. Augustus took a sip of his coffee, savoring the bitter warmth. I've spent my entire life demanding explanations, dissecting everyone's motives until there was nothing left but spreadsheets and profit margins. It's exhausting. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher above the hedge maze. A hummingbird darted between the jasmine flowers, its wings a blur of emerald and gold. Tyre Sagir, Elias murmured, so softly Augustus almost missed it. What does that mean? Elias flushed. Little bird. It's Italian. Your accent is beautiful. The compliment seemed to catch Elias off guard. He stared down at his coffee cup, his knuckles white against the porcelain. My parents spoke it at home. Old habits. Were they from here originally? No. The word came out clipped, final. But after a moment, Elias's shoulders relaxed slightly. They came here with nothing, worked 3 jobs each just to keep food on the table. They never learned English well, so He gestured vaguely. I became their translator, banks, doctors, schools. By the time I was 12, I was handling their tax paperwork. Augustus nodded slowly. That's a heavy burden for a child. Children adapt. Elias's voice carried an edge of old pain. We learn what we need to survive. And the other languages? Elias was quiet for so long that Augustus thought he wouldn't answer. Then, barely audible. Books. Libraries stayed open late, had heat in the winter. I read everything they had. Dictionaries, phrase books, literature in translation. Languages became an escape, I suppose. From what? From being invisible. The honesty in those words hit Augustus like a punch to the chest. He thought about his own childhood, private schools, summer homes, tutors for everything from tennis to Latin, the luxury of being seen, heard, expected to succeed. You're not invisible, he said quietly. Elias looked at him with something that might have been hope quickly suppressed. To most people I am. It's easier that way. Easier for whom? Before Elias could answer, Carmen's voice echoed across the garden. Mr. Augustus, your son is on the phone. The spell broke. Elias stood abruptly, setting his barely touched coffee on the bench. I should get back to work. Elias! But the gardener was already walking away, his shoulders rigid with something that looked like regret. Augustus stared at the abandoned coffee cup, steam still rising from its surface, and felt something shift inside his chest. When had he last sat with someone and simply talked? When had he last been curious about another person's story instead of their net worth? The phone call with Daniel was brief and strained, as they all were these days. His son lived 3,000 miles away, called once a month out of obligation, and spoke to Augustus like he was a business contact rather than family. How's the weather? Daniel asked, his voice flat through the speaker. Fine. The gardens are coming along well. Good. Look, Dad, I've got a meeting in 5 minutes. Of course you do. The silence stretched uncomfortably. I'll call next month, Daniel said finally. You always do. After hanging up, Augustus sat in his study staring at the phone. When had his relationship with his only child become so hollow? When had they stopped actually seeing each other? The answer came to him with uncomfortable clarity. Around the same time, he'd stopped seeing anyone else as more than a function in his carefully ordered world. That afternoon, Augustus found himself inventing reasons to walk through the gardens. He watched Elias work from a distance, noting the man's methodical precision, the way he seemed to communicate with the plants through touch alone. There was something almost meditative about his movements, like he was performing some ancient ritual rather than simple maintenance. The hydrangeas are responding well to the new soil mixture, Augustus called out as he approached. Elias glanced up, his hands still buried in dark earth. They prefer acidic conditions. Most people try to fight their nature instead of working with it. And you work with it. Everything grows better when you understand what it needs to thrive. Augustus heard the double meaning in those words, saw it in the careful way Elias avoided his eyes. What do you need to thrive? The question hung between them like morning mist. Elias's hands stilled in the soil. I don't know, he said finally. I've been surviving for so long. I'm not sure I remember the difference. That evening, Augustus made an impulsive decision. He walked to the staff quarters, a series of neat cottages behind the main house, and knocked on Elias's door. Elias answered in jeans and a simple white t-shirt, his hair still damp from a shower. Without the work clothes and the careful deference, he looked younger, more vulnerable. Augustus, is everything all right? I was wondering if you'd like to have dinner, not in the dining room, he added quickly, seeing Elias's expression. There's a small bistro downtown, nothing fancy. Sir, I don't think. It's just dinner between two people who both seem to be hiding from themselves. Elias studied his face for a long moment. You don't know anything about me. Then tell me. An hour later, they sat across from each other in a dimly lit restaurant, the kind of place where conversations were private and the wine list was written in chalk. Augustus had been there exactly once before, for a business dinner 5 years ago. Now, watching Elias study the menu with the same careful attention he gave to plants, it felt like discovering a new continent. Order in French, Augustus said impulsively. Elias looked up, startled. What? The waiter's French. I heard his accent. Order in French. Augustus, please. When the waiter approached, Elias hesitated for just a moment. Then, as if making a decision that went far beyond ordering food, he began to speak. The French that poured out of him was fluid, musical, tinged with what sounded like a Parisian accent. He discussed wine pairings, asked about preparation methods, even made what must have been a joke because the waiter laughed delightedly. Augustus watched, mesmerized, as Elias transformed before his eyes. His posture changed, his gestures became more animated, his entire face seemed to light up from within. This wasn't the careful, deferential gardener. This was someone else entirely, someone confident, cultured, fully alive. When the waiter left, Elias slumped back in his chair as if the performance had exhausted him. Who was that? Augustus asked softly. Someone I used to be. What happened to him? Elias reached for his wineglass, his hand not quite steady. Life happened. Reality happened. Dreams have a way of dying when you're too busy surviving to water them. The metaphor wasn't lost on Augustus. Dreams are like plants, then. Everything's like plants. Elias smiled sadly. They need the right conditions to grow. Most of us never get those conditions. What if you did? What if you could create them? Elias met his eyes across the table, and Augustus saw something there that made his breath catch, a flicker of hope, quickly suppressed but unmistakably present. Then I suppose, Elias said quietly, we'd find out what I'm really capable of. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier who insisted on a signature. Augustus turned the cream-colored envelope over in his hands, noting the elegant handwriting and foreign postmark. His name was written in careful script, Mr. Augustus. He found Elias in the greenhouse, surrounded by seedlings that seemed to glow in the filtered sunlight. Without preamble, he held out the letter. This is for you. Elias looked up from the delicate tomato plants he was transplanting, his hands still dirty from the rich potting soil. Sir, it's addressed to you. Well, to Elias. Augustus watched carefully for Elias's reaction. The clay pot slipped from Elias's fingers, shattering against the concrete floor. Soil scattered across his boots like brown snow. Where did you get this? It was delivered here. Someone knows where you are. Elias's face had gone pale beneath his tan. He stared at the envelope as if it might explode. I haven't used that name in years, but it is your name. It wasn't a question. Augustus had spent the last 3 weeks having quiet conversations with the other staff, piecing together fragments of information. Carmen had mentioned that Elias sometimes talked in his sleep, not in English or Spanish, but in something else entirely. The groundskeeper had noticed books in foreign languages hidden in Elias's cottage. Small clues, but enough to confirm what Augustus had suspected. It was my name, Elias said finally, a long time ago. Open it. Elias's hands shook as he tore the envelope. The letterhead was elegant, official-looking. As he read, his face cycled through a dozen emotions. Surprise, pain, something that might have been longing. What is it? An invitation. Elias's voice was barely a whisper. There's a conference. International Linguistics Symposium. They want me to present my research on extinct dialects. Augustus felt his pulse quicken. Your research? I documented languages before they disappeared, traveled to remote villages, recorded elderly speakers, preserved their stories. Elias looked up, his eyes bright with unshed tears. I published papers, won awards, before I became nobody. You're not nobody. I'm a gardener who speaks to plants because they're the only ones who listen without judgment. The bitterness in his voice cut deep. Augustus stepped closer, careful not to startle him. What happened? Why did you leave that life? Elias sank onto a wooden stool, the letter crumpled in his fist. My parents got sick. Both of them. Within 6 months of each other, I came home to take care of them, used all my savings on treatments that didn't work. By the time they died, I'd been out of academia for 3 years. My research grants expired, my position was filled, my contacts moved on. You could have gone back. With what? I had no money, no connections, no recent publications, and I was... He paused, searching for words. I was broken, watching your parents die slowly while you're helpless to save them. It does something to you, makes you question everything you thought mattered. Augustus understood that kind of loss, that feeling of everything familiar crumbling away. So you disappeared. I became invisible. It was easier than trying to rebuild something that had already fallen apart. They stood in silence, surrounded by the green promise of new growth. Augustus looked at this man who had spent years hiding his brilliance behind a facade of simplicity, and felt something fierce unfold in his chest. What if you didn't have to rebuild alone? Elias looked up sharply. What do you mean? The conference. Go. I can't. I don't have the funds, the credentials. I'll sponsor you. And the words hung in the air between them. Elias stared at Augustus as if he'd suggested flying to the moon. You don't understand what you're offering. I understand perfectly. I'm offering you a chance to be who you really are. And what if I fail? What if I've been away too long, forgotten too much? Augustus smiled. Then you'll fail as yourself instead of succeeding as someone else's idea of who you should be. The conference was 6 weeks away, in a city neither of them had ever visited. Augustus watched Elias prepare with the same methodical care he brought to gardening, researching other presenters, updating his materials, practicing his presentation in front of the bathroom mirror. But it was the small changes that affected Augustus most. The way Elias began holding himself straighter, speaking with more confidence, the way his eyes seemed brighter, more alive. It was like watching a plant that had been kept in shade finally moved into sunlight. I'm scared, Elias admitted one evening, as they sat in the garden, sharing their now traditional coffee and conversation. Of what? Of remembering who I used to be, of wanting things I can't have. Augustus set down his cup. What if you can have them? Then I'd have to leave. The words hit Augustus like a physical blow. In all his planning, all his encouragement, he hadn't considered the possibility that success might mean losing the one person who had made him remember what it felt like to be fully alive. "Would you want to leave?" Elias was quiet for a long time, watching a butterfly dance among the evening primroses. "Part of me would. The part that's been suffocating for years, that dreams in languages I'm not allowed to speak. And the other part has found something here I never expected to find." "What's that?" Elias turned to look at him, and Augustus saw everything in his eyes: gratitude, affection, and something deeper that made his heart race. "Peace," Elias said simply. "For the first time in my adult life, I wake up without the weight of pretending to be someone else." Augustus reached over and covered Elias's hand with his own. "Then take both parts with you. Take the scholar and the gardener, be everything you are." The night before Elias left for the conference, Augustus couldn't sleep. He wandered through the house like a ghost, eventually finding himself in the garden where everything had started. The roses were thriving now, their blooms full and fragrant in the moonlight. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to find Elias approaching, a small suitcase in his hand. "Couldn't sleep either." "Too much thinking," Augustus admitted. They walked together through the paths Elias had tended with such care, past the herb garden that smelled of rosemary and thyme, through the maze where Augustus had first heard those mysterious languages. "Whatever happens," Augustus said as they reached the gate where a car would arrive at dawn to take Elias to the airport, "I want you to know that meeting you changed something in me, something I thought was dead." Elias set down his suitcase and stepped closer. "What was that?" "The ability to see people as they really are, not just what they can do for me." In the darkness, Augustus felt rather than saw Elias smile. "You saw me when I couldn't even see myself. I saw someone worth knowing." They stood there in the garden they'd both come to love, two men who had found in each other something neither had been looking for: acceptance, understanding, the courage to be authentic in a world that rewarded pretense. "Promise me something," Augustus said. "What?" "Promise me you'll speak every language you know. Promise me you'll be brilliant and unashamed and everything you were meant to be." Elias reached out and took his hand. "Only if you promise me something in return." "Anything. Promise me you'll remember that you deserve to be seen too, that you're more than your money or your success, that you're someone worth knowing." As the first hints of dawn touched the eastern sky, they made promises in the garden where everything had begun to grow. The auditorium was packed with academics from around the world, their conversations creating a polyglot symphony that would have made Elias smile if he weren't so terrified. He stood backstage, adjusting his tie for the 100th time, the research folder in his hands damp with sweat. 3,000 miles away, Augustus sat in his study, staring at his phone. The conference was being live-streamed, but he'd been too nervous to watch. Instead, he'd spent the morning in the garden, talking to the roses Elias had nurtured back to health. "Ladies and gentlemen," the moderator's voice crackled through the conference hall speakers, "our next presenter is Dr. Elias, presenting his research on preserving endangered linguistic heritage." Dr. Elias. The title felt foreign on his tongue after so many years of being simply Elias the gardener. But as he walked onto the stage, something miraculous happened. The years of hiding, of making himself small and invisible, fell away like old clothes. He stood behind the podium, looking out at an audience of his peers, and remembered who he had been before loss had taught him to diminish himself. "Bienvenue, welcome." His voice carried across the auditorium, steady and clear. "I want to begin by acknowledging that every language we lose is a universe of human experience that vanishes forever." In his study, Augustus finally opened the live stream. The first thing he noticed was how different Elias looked. Confident, animated, completely transformed. This was the man he'd glimpsed over coffee and quiet conversations, the brilliant mind that had been hiding behind careful deference. 7 years ago, Elias continued, I had the privilege of recording the last native speaker of a dialect spoken in the mountains of northern Morocco. Her name was Aisha, and she was 93 years old. When she died 3 months later, an entire way of understanding the world died with her. The audience was completely silent, captivated by both the content and the passion with which it was delivered. Elias moved away from the podium, his gestures natural and engaging. But here's what I learned from Aisha and from dozens of other speakers I had the honor to document. Languages aren't just communication tools. They're repositories of dreams, of ways of seeing that exist nowhere else. He clicked to the next slide, showing a photograph of an elderly woman sitting in a garden, her hands gesturing as she spoke into a recording device. Aisha had 17 different words for loneliness. Not sadness, not isolation, specifically loneliness. Each word described a different shade of the human experience of being alone. When her language died, we lost not just words, but distinctions of feeling that had been refined over centuries. Augustus found himself leaning forward, completely absorbed. He'd never seen Elias like this, passionate, eloquent, fully alive. This was who the man had been all along, buried under years of survival and self-protection. I want to play you something, Elias said, his voice softer now. This is Aisha singing a lullaby her grandmother taught her. It's about seeds sleeping in the earth, waiting for the right moment to grow. The recording filled the auditorium. An elderly woman's voice, weathered but beautiful, singing in a language that would soon exist only in digital archives. The melody was haunting, alien yet somehow familiar, like a half-remembered dream. Augustus felt tears on his cheeks. He understood now why Elias spoke to plants, why he treated each flower with such reverence. He was carrying forward something precious, something that connected all growing things across the barriers of language and culture. When the song ended, the auditorium was completely silent. Then, slowly, applause began. Not the polite academic clapping Augustus had expected, but something deeper, more moved. This is why we do this work, Elias said into the reverent quiet. Not to preserve words, but to honor the human imagination that created them. Every language we save is a victory against the silence that wants to swallow us all. The presentation lasted 45 minutes, but Augustus felt as if he'd watched Elias transform in real time from the hidden man he'd known into someone blazing with purpose. During the question and answer session, Elias fielded inquiries in at least 6 different languages, his responses thoughtful and nuanced. Afterward, as Augustus watched through the screen, he saw people crowding around Elias, exchanging cards, talking animatedly. One woman, a professor from a prestigious university, according to her introduction, seemed particularly interested in his work. Augustus closed the laptop and sat back in his chair, filled with a mixture of pride and profound loneliness. He'd given Elias the chance to reclaim his life, but in doing so, he'd also set him free to leave. The phone rang that evening while Augustus was having dinner alone in the formal dining room, something he'd done every night for 15 years, but which now felt impossibly hollow. Augustus! Elias's voice was bright with excitement. I did it! I actually did it! I watched. You were magnificent. I felt like myself again. For the first time in 7 years, I felt like myself. Augustus smiled despite the ache in his chest. That's wonderful. You deserve to feel that way always. There's more. Dr. Sarah from the university offered me a position, a real position with research funding and everything. I could restart my career, build on the work I began years ago. That's incredible news. Augustus meant it, even as his heart broke a little more. When would you start? That's the thing. Elias's voice grew quieter. I told her, I needed time to think about it, to discuss it with someone important to me. Augustus gripped the phone tighter. With who? With you. The words hung between them across 3,000 miles of distance. Augustus closed his eyes, trying to process what he was hearing. Elias, you can't give up this opportunity for what? For the best friend I've ever had? For the man who saw me when I couldn't see myself? I won't be the reason you don't follow your dreams. What if you're part of the dream now? Augustus felt something crack open in his chest. What are you saying? I'm saying that for 7 years I thought I'd lost everything that mattered. But sitting in that auditorium today, talking about preserving things that are precious and rare, all I could think about was what I'd found in your garden. The roses? Elias laughed, and the sound made Augustus feel less alone than he had in years. Not just the roses, though they're doing beautifully, by the way. I'm talking about us, about whatever this is that we've built together. Augustus walked to the window overlooking the garden, now bathed in moonlight. What are you proposing? Dr. Sarah's university has a satellite campus here. They need someone to develop their language preservation program from the ground up. It would mean I could continue my research while staying close to home. The word home hit Augustus like a physical blow. Is that what this place is to you? It's what you are to me. They were both quiet for a long moment, the weight of the admission settling between them. Come back, Augustus said finally. We'll figure out the rest together. Are you sure? Augustus looked out at the garden where everything had begun, where 2 lost men had found something neither had been looking for. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. 2 days later, Augustus waited at the airport, more nervous than he'd been before any business deal. When Elias emerged from the terminal, the first thing Augustus noticed was how he carried himself, shoulders back, head high, every inch the accomplished academic he'd always been underneath. But when their eyes met across the crowded arrivals hall, Elias smiled the same gentle smile that had first captured Augustus's attention in the garden. And Augustus knew that all the essential parts of the man he'd come to love were still there. They drove home in comfortable silence, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the landscape. When they pulled through the gates of the estate, Elias leaned forward in his seat. The roses, he breathed. While he'd been gone, Augustus had spent hours in the garden, talking to the plants as he'd seen Elias do, telling them about the conference, about how proud he was, about how much he missed their caretaker. Whether it was the attention or simply good timing, the rose garden had exploded into the most spectacular bloom Augustus had ever seen. They missed you, Augustus said simply. That evening they sat in their usual spot in the garden, sharing coffee and catching up. Elias told Augustus about the conference, about the job offer, about his plans for the new research program. Augustus listened, asking questions, marveling at the passion in Elias's voice. There's something else, Elias said as the conversation wound down, something I realized while I was away. What's that? I spent so many years hiding from who I was that I forgot what it felt like to be seen. Really seen, not just observed or categorized or judged, but truly seen by another person. Augustus set down his coffee cup. And now? Now I know that being seen is just the beginning. The real miracle is learning to see yourself through the eyes of someone who loves you. The word hung in the air between them, simple and profound. Love. Not the desperate, grasping kind that Augustus had known in his younger years, but something deeper. Acceptance, recognition, the quiet joy of finding someone whose soul spoke the same language as your own. I love you too, Augustus said quietly. They sat together in the garden as night fell around them, 2 men who had found in each other not just companionship, but the courage to be completely themselves. Around them, the roses bloomed in the darkness, their fragrance a reminder that beautiful things could grow in any soil, given enough patience and care. In the weeks that followed, Their life settled into a new rhythm. Elias divided his time between the garden and his research, setting up a home office where he could continue his work on language preservation while staying close to the plants and the man he. Have you ever hidden a part of yourself just to survive? What would happen if someone truly saw you for who you really are? If this story moved you, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us keep telling meaningful stories.